I think we can start, and other people can still join. Um, so welcome everyone. My name is Stephanie. I think the first thing that I should point out, and I've posted this already in the waiting room chat, that this meeting will be recorded. So if you don't want to be seen, then you can turn your cameras off. The The Q&A will not be recorded, so feel free to then turn your cameras back on if you want to ask questions. Oh, is it already recording? Great. Okay, and I'm gonna share my screen now. Okay, I hope you can all see that. You should be able to see my screen now. If not, let me know. Okay, yeah. Welcome to this talk today on bias in data, how technology reinforces social stereotypes. Just a few more things on housekeeping, I guess. I've already mentioned the recording bit, so I won't go into that again. Regarding questions, so if you want to ask a question after the talk or already during the talk, you can type it in the chat box, obviously, but the other option is if you want to, you can also ask it in person, and I would suggest that you just put a little Q in the chat box and then wait until I call your name, and then you can unmute yourself and ask the question, and also turn on your camera if you want to. So that it would also be good if you actually have a name, a proper name as your name, so that I know who to call out. And a final disclaimer, I will be talking about hate speech. I'm not going to use any extreme examples. But just to let you know, I will be talking about hate speech, and that might be triggering for some. So when that part comes up, feel free to skip it. Yeah, I will let you know about that. So first, I would like to introduce my project and myself a little bit, just to give you some of the background, who we are and what we do. So I am based at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, in short, CRASH. And the project that I am part of is called Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, the Social Impact of Artificially Intelligent Communications Technology. And we are a mixed team. We're an interdisciplinary group, and that intentionally so. So we have people coming together from linguistics, computational linguistics, engineering. We've got people from the machine intelligence lab, as you can see on this slide. And I myself, my background is in linguistics. So I've done research on the functions of language in society and also in politics. And I've also done research on the role of new media and new communications technologies. And that includes some of what I'm going to talk about today. I've done some research on hate speech and also on bias in data, which will be the main topics for today's talk. So just a few more words on what we actually mean when we talk about artificially intelligent communications technology. So basically, we're interested in any kinds of modern smart technologies that are language-based. So that includes speech technology like speech recognition, speech synthesis, machine translation, and dialogue systems, and natural language processing. So natural language understanding, generation, sentiment analysis, and so on. And you use these technologies probably every day. Certainly when you might communicate to Alexa or Siri or Cortana, which are the most well-known virtual personal assistants and kind of prototypical examples of a artificially intelligent communications technology. So this just as a brief overview of what we do as a project. And now today's talk is going to focus on bias, different forms of bias. So I'm briefly going to talk about what bias is in general, and talk about different types of bias that have been identified specifically in language technology. And then I'm going to talk about two examples, so two case studies, one focusing on racial bias and automated hate speech detection, and then the other example is forms of gender bias and machine translation, and finding ways of mitigating or reducing this bias in the process. And I'm going to close off with conclusions, obviously, and an outlook on, yeah, what can be improved in the future. First of all, just you've probably all seen these headlines about sexist algorithms, racist algorithms, and technology, Google Translate being sexist, um, racist robots. This is just an overview of the multitude of headlines that have made the news in recent years, just to give you an idea of the how pressing this topic really is. Um, so what is bias actually, and what does bias mean in the context of AI? And I want to point out at this moment that when I use the term AI, I use it very broadly. So I'm aware that AI includes a great variety of different smart technologies. And what I'll be talking about today is just a brief portion of all those different technologies, specifically focusing on, as I said already, anything related to language and the processing of language. So biases are essentially human, and they're part of our cognitive structures and what make us the individuals that we are. So they're kind of natural, but they also kind of illustrate a sort of deviation from the norm as it has been defined in behavioral psychology. So anytime we encounter something new and unfamiliar that does not match the internalized rules and of logic and the kind of mental models that we've internalized based on our experiences of where we grew up, who we socialize with, um, those situations can result in cognitive biases. So an incongruity between internalized rules and unknown, unfamiliar conditions. Um, and if we leave them unchallenged, they can affect our behaviors and our social interactions. And equally, they can also lead to linguistic biases. So a kind of systematic variation that defines the way we speak. And I want to point out that some biases may, of course, correctly reflect real world demographics. So if we have the case of data where breast cancer correlates most frequently with women than men, that has to do that this disease is more common in females in the real world as well. So that might be a bias that correctly reflects the actual real world situation. But in most cases, unfortunately, they incorrectly represent actual distributions in society. And we see something that has been called a system or systematic bias. So, where we see structural imbalances that exist in our societies and our economic institutions all over the world, basically. And these biases are man made. But importantly, they can also be incorporated into and amplified by technology and automated processes. And this is what I'll be focusing on today. Um, how does bias actually get into language systems? How is it amplified? And just for anyone who does not have a background in the field of natural language processing, just a few words on what I mean when I say natural language processing or NLP. That area is an intersection between the field of computer science on the one hand and linguistics on the other hand. And computers are used to process meaning, to analyze and to generate large amounts of human language and to basically try and understand it as well as possible. And examples, prominent examples of these kinds of systems that I will also be mentioning today are machine translation, most commonly forms of or systems that help to retrieve and extract information, sentiment analysis, or question answering systems. So when we speak about bias and NLP, we usually talk about cases where computer systems, and I'm quoting Friedman and Nissenbaum here, where computer systems systematically and unfairly discriminate against certain individuals or groups of individuals in favor of others. And it is important to point out in this context that these kinds of biases can have a variety of sources. They can take different kinds of shapes and they can occur at different stages in the process of um, yeah, language processing. Meaning it can occur at the data level, it can occur at the annotation level, it can be a problem with the model itself. And I will say a few more things about these different types of biases now. So I'm referring here mostly to a publication by Shaw, Schwartz, and Hovey from 2020, who identified 4 types of bias in NLP and in language processing systems. And those 4 types are selection bias, label bias, semantic bias, and model overamplification. And I will just try to explain them briefly so that you understand the different kind of points where bias can occur. So the first type, selection bias, basically occurs at the data level. So this has to do with the data itself. So the most important thing for any language system to work efficiently is the data it is trained on. And so to give you an example we can probably all relate to at the moment is the example of vaccines. And when a vaccine is tested on a group of let's say, healthy young individuals, but essentially it will be used most likely for elderly individuals and or people with pre-existing health conditions, then we already see a bias in the subset that was used to train the system, or in this case, the vaccine that will eventually be used on a different kind of audience. And to use an example more related to technology, if a system is trained and tested on, let's say, data that includes only Wikipedia articles, but the task eventually will be that it is used to detect harmful language on Twitter, the text types are so different that the data the system was trained on has very little to do with the data that the system will eventually occur um, when it is set to work. So selection bias basically means that a sample is not representative of what the system is eventually set out to do. A different kind of bias is label bias, and this occurs at the stage of where the data is annotated. So usually before a system, a language system is trained on a given data set, in a lot of cases, it still requires annotation by humans. So we have a given training data set that is annotated by humans according to different categories. And eventually the system will learn how to categorize different examples just as in the training set. So that makes it easier to recognize certain patterns and to categorize the examples according to these criteria. And so if that annotation or labeling is already incorrect or not really fully representative, that obviously leads to biased outcomes. One example is actually what I will talk about in more detail in just a moment, is that of hate speech detection, where phrases or expressions in African American English have been incorrectly classified as offensive or harmful because human annotators are rarely representative of this specific demographic group. And so they're unfamiliar with this kind of dialect or register. And due to that unfamiliarity, they incorrectly label the data. So that leads to bias. Another type of bias is semantic bias, which relates to the representation within the data as well. And that kind of arises from associative relations in the language. So if we have a data set where, let's say, a word like doctor occurs very often in the context of the male pronoun, but only very rarely in the context of the female pronoun, that is a problem of representation and association. So a doctor is associated with male and will not be associated equally with female pronouns. And then finally, what can also happen is that when you already have a biased data set, for example, or you have biased annotation, eventually the language model that will work with the data and process the data can amplify that bias. So here you have the example from a publication by Chao et al. From 2017. If you have a data set where cooking is primarily associated with women, the assumption could be made by the model that just all women cook and men do not cook, which is just a magnification of an already very problematic stereotype. And so this is essentially what can happen when the model amplifies an already existing bias. Okay, moving on to my first case study or example. And here I'm going to talk about racial bias, as I just mentioned, in automated hate speech detection. So I'm mostly referring to these two publications by Sapp et al. And Davidson et al. By both from 2019. So just a few words on hate speech. I'm sure you all have heard about it, about the problem, and you all have an idea of what hate speech looks like. But just to give you a few numbers to illustrate the importance of this problem. So hate speech continues to be a significant problem on social media platforms. And it seems like the current pandemic has only further amplified this already existing problem. And according to the the Oxford Internet Survey from 2019, between 30 and 40% of people in the UK say that they have at some point seen online abuse occur. And even 10 to 20% of people say that they have personally experienced online abuse. So these are worrying numbers, and it becomes even more worrying when we look at numbers from the UK Home Office from 2020, where it states that the number of hate crimes has also been steadily increasing over the past 5 to 6 years. And most of these offenses, 72% actually, are based on ethnicity and race, followed by motivating factors like religion and sexual orientation. And if we look on the right, the statistics showing that showing the number of hate speech posts that had to be taken down by Facebook over the past years, we see that in the first quarter of 2019, 4 million posts had to be deleted by Facebook because they contained hate speech. So, and hate speech, the problem has also raised discussions about free speech and censorship. Shouldn't everyone be allowed to say whatever they want? Isn't deleting content online just another form of censorship? But there have also been first approaches or first steps towards regulation on different national levels and transnational levels. So, for example, Germany in 2016, I think, just have to check. No, in 2017, introduced a new law that puts more pressure on social media companies. So, if a post is reported on Twitter or Facebook, the company has to react within 24 hours and take it down. Otherwise, they will be fined. And in the UK, the Online Harms White Paper has been published in 2019. And also at the European level, we have seen the Code of Conduct for Appropriate Behavior online being published in 2017. So we've seen different regulatory approaches, and there are recurring calls for independent watchdogs in different countries. And at the corporate level, we still see that most companies still follow a reactive approach, which basically means, as you can also see in the quote by Mark Zuckerberg on the right-hand side, which was taken from his Senate hearing in 2018, most posts only get taken down once they have been reported by a user. So people need to flag it, and then they will look at it. Content moderators, still mostly humans, will look at it, consider the policies of the company, and then either delete it or not. And as Zuckerberg here also says, he's optimistic that over a 5 to 10 year period, we will have AI tools that can get into some of the nuances, the linguistic nuances of different types of content to be more accurate in flagging things for our systems. But today, we're just not there on that. So, and he's got a point there, because there are still some issues that exist, problems that exist that make a large scale use of automated hate speech detection systems difficult. There are great advances being made, and we've done our own research in this area. We've published a paper on hate speech in 2019 that you can see here, and proposed a quarantining approach, because a lot of these systems actually already have very good accuracy rates. So they work kind of well. But the problems that still exist are that, for example, there is no universal definition of hate speech. And at the same time, depending on which study you look at, you see different kinds of classifications and subtypes of hate speech. So some distinguish between offensive or non-offensive, racist, not racist, anti-Semitic, all these different subtypes that make it difficult to reach kind of a common universal way of categorizing this type of language. And when Mark Zuckerberg talks about the nuances of language, sarcasm and irony are still particularly challenging for humans already, and definitely for language recognition systems. So that is still a great problem, a great concern. And then there is lack of common training data or test data. So there are plenty of studies that exist on hate speech detection, but they all use individual training sets. And then there's the subjective annotation of data, which I want to focus on now. So as I've already mentioned, training data sets still largely need to be annotated by human annotators. And these are mostly found via crowdsourcing, for example, using Amazon Mechanical Turk. These people are qualified as annotators, but usually what they're asked to do is they're given different categories. For example, when they see a post, they have to decide whether it is offensive or not. And that is, of course, a very subjective way of categorizing. Like, what is subjective what is offensive to me might not necessarily be offensive for someone else. And this has caused significant issues in the context of hate speech detection. So yeah, as you can see on the left, that is actually an image taken from the paper by Sapp et al. You can see that tweets were incorrectly classified or categorized as toxic because they were, first of all, perceived by an annotator as toxic, and then that was replicated by the language model. And as I said, toxic language or offensive language is very subjective, and it depends on the social context, a speaker's identity, the very specific dialect or register that someone speaks. And if the annotator is unfamiliar with a given dialect, that will lead to incorrect labeling. And the models then acquire and replicate this bias. So in this case, which would be these examples, or some of these examples, would be absolutely unacceptable if, let's say, a white person typed these things. But if someone from the African American community said these things, they would not be toxic or offensive, not necessarily. But also, most annotators are still largely white and have a white background. So it's very difficult to label correctly. And some potential solutions and ways of mitigation have been introduced, such as by Sapp et al., who propose dialect and ethnicity priming. So their idea is that when people have to annotate a data set, they're posed different questions. Is this offensive or disrespectful to you? Could you imagine this being offensive, disrespectful to anyone else? And then they also get, or could get, a prompt like this, showing them the tweet and also a warning that could look something like this, telling them our AI system thinks this is African American English. And that has actually shown that when annotators are prompted with just this piece of information, that they are significantly less likely to label an African American English tweet as potentially offensive to anyone. Additionally, race priming makes workers less likely to find African American English, tweets offensive to them. So it does at least increase people's awareness, um, and makes people think about, oh, there could be a different background. I should consider this from someone else's background. Okay, moving on to the second example now, which is gender bias in machine translation. And I'm mostly going to refer to research that we have done um, as a project, looking at ways of reducing or mitigating gender bias in machine translation. And so I've posted the links to these two publications in the chat box, so feel free to have a look. The academic paper is open access, and there has also been a conversation article just published yesterday, yeah, to give you an introduction to what we do. Yeah, again, you've probably seen some of these headlines. Google Translate might have a gender problem. The algorithm that helped Google Translate become sexist. Google Translate gender bias pairs he with hardworking and she with lazy. And these are just a few examples. So what has been the problem is that in some cases when translating, or here we even see an example from Apple's autocorrect, when translating from a gender neutral language to English, for example, these systems tend to make assumptions that are very stereotypical, like assuming that by CEO we are referring to a male. So we can see the male emoji being suggested here and the user being quite appalled by that. And yeah, the same thing here on the right. So Turkish is a gender-less language. I'm going to say a little bit more about what gender means in language in just a moment. But Turkish is a gender-less language, and if you translate it into English, a choice has to be made. And Google Translate usually, it used to make choices like he is a doctor, just assuming that doctor has to be male. I have to point out that Google is aware of this problem and they have been working on fixing it. And so for a few languages, we are now given choices. So like you can see on the right-hand side, she is a doctor or he is a doctor, so you can decide which translation you prefer. So a few words on grammatical gender, if you're not familiar with this or aware of it. So grammatical gender actually in language has nothing to do with social gender. So it has nothing to do with a social identity, if we identify as male or female, or if we want to be addressed in any kind of more neutral kind of way. So that is a totally separate discussion that would be worth an entire talk of its own. But when we talk about grammatical gender in language, we actually talk about how nouns are categorized in a language. And in most cases, that is according to similarities in meaning or sound. And it has been found that approximately 25% of all languages that we know in the world make use of some kind of grammatical gender. And some cases do actually correlate with gender in humans, but not necessarily all of them. So if you look at these examples here from German, we see that the forms for woman and man are actually also, so for the woman, die Frau, it's actually also female in German, and the man, der Mann, is male. But then you have other inanimate entities that are just randomly assigned a grammatical gender, or as I said before, depending on whether they share any similarities in meaning or sound. And I don't want to go through all of the different options of assigning grammatical gender in a language. But just to give you an idea, I suppose the most well-known forms are to distinguish between masculine and feminine, as we know from languages like French, Spanish, and Hindi. But then, or in German, where we have three different cases of grammatical gender: masculine, feminine, and neuter. In some languages, there are even more than three different types of grammatical gender. So it can get quite complex. But then on the other hand, we also have cases like English, which actually does not really have any grammatical gender anymore, except for, of course, gender pronouns and some nouns like actress and actor, where you still have two different forms to choose from. But for the most part, there is no grammatical gender left in English. And then there are cases like Finnish or Hungarian or Turkish, which are completely genderless, meaning that they don't even have gender pronouns. So if you look at this example from Finnish, um, screenshots of Google Translate, translating these examples from Finnish into English. In Finnish, you have the gender neutral pronoun hen, which is used for both men and women. Um, and in English, it gets translated, or it has to get translated, I guess, into either he or she, or maybe even they. And here we can see Google used to make very stereotypical assumptions, presuming that a doctor is male and a nurse is female. On the other hand, if you try to translate from English into German, you have a similar problem in that a choice has to be made whether doctor is translated into the female or the male form. And here we can see that even when using the noun in combination with a gender pronoun, like the doctor finished her shift, it is still likely that the translation system goes for the male option because it is just more dominant. So der Arzt beendete ihre Schicht. The pronoun has been correctly translated, but the noun still has the incorrect gender. And some of these, just to point out, I'm not trying to blame Google here or anything. These cases are very complicated. So if we look at English and a sentence like this, a smart linguist loves his, her, or their books, it would be relatively easy to just make changes to that because you only have one item that you need to change. But if we look at German, it just inflects different elements of the sentence with grammatical gender. So it's not just one item that we need to consider, but a multitude of different items within the sentence that we need to change. So it's not simple. There are different levels of complexity. Swedish is another example that is relatively easy, a bit like English. And in Sweden, they have actually introduced a gender neutral pronoun in 2015, where previously something like this did not exist. But this is possible in a language like English or Swedish, but would be very difficult to consider in German. It's possible, but it would take a lot more consideration and work. And now looking at our research in more detail, so we try to think of ways of how to mitigate these biases when they occur in machine translation. And we used a training data set, first of all, that consisted of English and German data. So translated sentences with English being the original language and then translated into German. So the total number of sentence pairs was over 17 million. The data was obtained via Common Crawl, which is a tool that basically just scrapes the internet. So that is important to know because it defines the kind of text types we will encounter. So in this case, we had a lot of formal text, but also very informal examples in slang. And interestingly, a lot of archaic words because there ended up, like a lot of Bible texts ended up in the in the data set. And so the first thing we did was we actually wanted to take a more detailed look at the data. So we took a subset of the data, 5% of these 17 million sentence pairs, and we did a corpus analysis of this data set. So we used, in this case, an analysis tool, Sketch Engine, to look at frequencies of different words and in what contexts certain words like man or woman are used in these texts. Yeah, and to just give you an idea, these are the raw numbers for just different gendered pronouns we looked at, and gendered nouns and adjectives, family relations, and professions. And if you just look at these raw numbers, you already see, for example, in case of he and she, how much more common the male pronoun is compared to the female. But then we also have other cases where it's actually skewed in the opposite direction. So we have wife, which is a lot more frequent than husband. And the same is the case for boy versus girl. So girl being a lot more frequent than boy. And this may actually, or this has a lot to do with the nature of the texts that were included in this corpus. As I mentioned, a lot of Bible texts, which affected the choice of words like wife, but also high numbers of words like his. And girl is actually also an interesting case. When we look in more detail at the contexts in which the word girl was used in the data set, we saw this. So this is just a visual representation of the connections between different words. So the bigger the circles are, the stronger the connection is between girl and that word or construction. So we see that girl is used a lot of the time in contexts like cute, hot, nude, naked, young, charming, beautiful. So gives you an idea of the kind of texts that were also included in this data set, which tends to represent girls in highly sexualized contexts. This is important because it will eventually affect the quality of the translation if a language system is trained on this kind of data. Yeah, I don't want to go into detail on the German part of the corpus because the numbers are basically the same, just with slight variations, which has to do with the differences just in the two languages. And just a final thing, we looked specifically at the relation of gender and professions. So again, doctor, how is this translated into German? Was the male form chosen or the female? And again, we see that the number for the male choice
like 20
is way
times
higher than the female counterpart. And this is basically the case for all these professions, which are stereotypically associated with men, and that's also why we chose them, because we wanted to see how is that stereotype represented in the data. And then on the other hand, when we look at something like nurse, which is commonly associated with women, we actually see, although the numbers are generally very low, we still see that they're higher for the female counterpart in the German translation. So what did we try to do now to actually avoid this kind of bias being adopted by the translation system? So, and I have to give credit at this point to a PhD student from the engineering department who did all this work and who set up all the experiments and tested all these different methods. So I want to give credit to Danielle Saunders. I don't know if she's on the talk, but just to say that I did not perform these experiments, so I will not take credit for that. But what we tried were basically two different ways. We tried removing the bias before actually training the system. Um, and then we also tried removing it after the training process. So first, removing the bias before training, it's impossible to remove all biases.
Okay.
So that wasn't the goal. But there are different strategies of reducing most of the bias before actually training the system. One option would be downsampling. So that would mean from the data set, we remove all the data, all the bias data, until we have a balanced ratio of gender terms for both languages. On the other hand, we could also upsample the data. So add as much duplicated data until we have a balanced amount of gender terms, again, in both languages. So we have these two options. And then we have what is called counterfactual augmentation. That means we introduce counterfactual sentences that include the underrepresented gendered terms. So if we say we have in the corpus, he is a doctor, and the German equivalent, er ist ein Arzt, we just create a counterfactual sentence for the female counterpart, like she is a doctor, and the same for German, and add that to the corpus so that in the end, we again end up with a more balanced data set. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but the results basically showed that there were no significant gains from making these changes prior to training. So it didn't improve the accuracy scores, it didn't improve the quality of the translations. So this kind of turned out to be altogether ineffectual because we still end up with difficult examples like the plural here. I've taken this example, engineers say, which in German is Ingenieure sagen. And the problem is that even if we have the plural here, in German, this is still the masculine form. So there are still quite complicated cases that remain and pose a problem to the translation system. Then the other thing that we tried was removing gender bias after the training process. And here we used the entire data set, so the several millions of sentence pairs. But then, so we trained the translation system on the entire data set. But then, in addition, we used a very small gender balanced set of or subset of data to fine tune the system. And we called this tiny because it was really a very tiny data set. And so in this tiny data set, we used basically in total just under 400 sentences. We focused specifically on gendered professions, and every sentence basically had to follow a specific template, as you can see here. The profession finished his or her work, such as the engineer finished her work. So every single translated pair had to follow a structure like that. And the result was basically that this managed to improve the quality of the translation considerably. So here we actually did find notable benefits. And we can see that if we address the bias and adapt the model accordingly with just a small data set, we can actually make a significant change to the accuracy of the model and to the quality of the translation. So this worked particularly well. Now, my conclusions. Basically, I mean, we've seen and we probably all know that biases are everywhere. Not just in humans, but they're encoded in the technologies that we use. And we saw that they can manifest themselves in different forms and at different stages in the data, in the annotation, and the model itself. but they can also be mitigated. And I think these are the most important points. It is important that people know the data they're working with. So I know this is difficult because a lot of people who develop these systems and who do the coding, they're not necessarily linguists and they don't have the time to actually look at all their
Give me a
corpora.
second.
But it is important to know what
Swat.
kind of data is in the corpus. We can adapt the model um, with just small changes, as we just saw. Um, we absolutely need more diversity in annotators and the coders themselves. Um, and we just need, I think, to raise more awareness that these problems exist. And to finish off, I wanna read out this quote just briefly because I think it sums it up perfectly, and it basically, yeah, it summarizes the main problem. So this is by Deborah Raji from MIT Tech Review, and she wrote, "Those of us building these systems will choose which online sources to crawl, which languages to use or ignore, which data sets to remove or accept. Most important, we choose who we apply these algorithms to and which objectives we optimize for. We choose the labels we create, the data we take in, the methods we use. We choose who we welcome as data scientists, engineers, and researchers, and who we do not. There were many possibilities for the design of the technology we built, and we chose this one. We are responsible." So, yeah, I just wanted to, I thought that was a good way of finishing it. Um, we shouldn't necessarily blame the algorithm because there are still people behind it that make the decisions. Yeah, thank you very much. And oh God, I've run way over time, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions now.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was, I think, trying to interject before, and then I realized my mic was off.
Oh,
Um, yeah, sorry about that. I also was probably best to wait. So I speak some Swahili. I'm not fluent. I'm actually in Kenya at the moment. I'm American though. So Swahili is a Bantu language. Just like, so it's noun classes are called grammatical gender, but there is actually no gender in the noun classes of
mm-hmm.
Swahili. And I don't think other Bantu languages. I just talked to my husband that also speaks Kikuyu, and he speaks Swahili fluently, and he's like, yeah, there's no noun classes don't have any gender in
Okay.
Kikuyu and no Bantu languages he knows of. But yeah, it's called grammatical gender, but like noun classes are often called grammatical gender, but like in the context when you're applying it to human gender, it was
Yeah,
just like kind of a mismatch. I'm also not a linguist, by the way. I code things, but thought I would
that's
add my 2 cents.
yeah, that's perfectly fine. I mean, thank you for pointing that out. I am a linguist, but obviously I don't speak all the languages, so I'm
Oh, of
actually
course,
very
yeah.
grateful that you point this out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can always send. So my husband also does machine learning, and he's spoken Swahili and Kikuyu since he's a kid. If you're interested in talking to him about it, he knows a lot more. Um, but
Yeah, that's
anyways,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
mhm. Yeah. So I sorry, um, but this is a great talk. I loved it.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna take a look at the questions now. Um, so that was okay. The first one I see is by Mark Russell. 4 million out of how many posts? What is the acceptable rate? I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question correctly. Or maybe he's left. So I'm not sure what the 4 million refers to. When did I talk about 4 million?
it was the hate speech, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yes. Okay. Oh, yeah, I see. That refers to the numbers of posts that Facebook had to delete. I honestly, um, I cannot answer the question of how, like 4 million out of how many posts. I guess that you would have to take the entirety of posts that are posted on Facebook within 1/4 of the year. I have no idea what that is. What is the acceptable rate of such things? If that relates to how is something identified as hate speech, that is absolutely subjective. Distinct guidelines and policies. So, and they change almost on a daily basis. So they have their own ways of rating what is acceptable or not. Um, yeah. Your sarcasm is a very, very difficult element of language to identify, especially for artificial intelligence. Just seeing you, you already answered some of your questions and comments already, which I appreciate because I didn't follow the questions while I was talking. Okay, I'll read out the question by Monica. Considering that hate speech cannot always be recognized correctly by AI, would an option of detecting it before posting more appropriate? Yes, I think so too. So this is basically, yeah, this is one of the biggest issues I think that the reactive approach by social media companies um, still faces is that they react after the harm has already been done, basically. So this is kind of what we suggested. If it is possible to have a detection system that can identify hate speech, um, we can use kind of a sort of quarantining method. So either check with the writer, the composer of the post, like, are you sure you want to post this? This could potentially be very harmful, or to protect other people from immediately being exposed to it. So, in the sense that a virus, a computer virus detection system would protect you from the virus just immediately having access to your computer, but it will put it in a quarantine and then inform you about it and give you the choice of what to do about it. So this is kind of what we would also like to see with regard to hate speech, to be able to protect people or give control back to people and avoid the actual harm being done. Hmm. Okay, well, that's a very good question. How do you think the current racial inequality impacts stereotype and bias, and what can we do? Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it has a great impact. And as I said, one of the biggest issues is that um, a lot of the annotators and a lot of the people working in computer science and engineering are still predominantly white. And that is not necessarily due to a lack of talented and skilled non-white people. As you said, there are more structural issues, and I think definitely when it comes to annotating data such as hate speech, I think we just need to make sure that if we use human annotators, we use a diverse group of people to make sure that we don't only have one perspective, and that is white people who've probably never faced any kind of offensive language. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a very important question. I don't know what to do about the problem as a whole, but I think making sure we have more diverse groups of annotators and people working on these technologies is a very important step. Yeah, I can definitely share the slides. I don't know if we can kind of share it via, I have to check with the administrative team. But if there's a possibility, I'm happy to share my slides. Just having a look. It's like ongoing.